Welcome to the Forward Marketing Podcast, the podcast that covers internet marketing strategies and leadership tactics to move your business forward. With your host, Joshua Jarvis. Hey, and welcome back to the Forward Marketing Podcast. Again, I am your host, Joshua Jarvis, and real excited about today's episode. I guess I'm excited about every single episode. It seems like I say that all the time. Last week we talked about some really simple ways of increasing your website traffic, and kind of enjoyed that episode as well. This past week I had 2 phone calls as well as an email, and kind of wanted to cover those with you today. This is not going to be a random episode though. It's really, how do you know if you've been swatted by Google and how to avoid it? So this will kind of bleed in from last week's episode as far as how to avoid it, but how do you know if you've been swatted by Google? So before we go into the dreaded, have I been swatted by Google? Did Google algorithms change my traffic? Let's talk a little bit about Google. And to understand that you guys, I mean as in like the general person, is going to see on the news Google changes, and those changes are going to be, you're going to see that sort of a quarterly thing. So the most recent one happened in August, and that's when they came out and said, we made a change specifically to medical related websites and how the algorithm looks at those. So but in reality, so every year there's like 1 or 2 really big changes, and they announce those. But what most people don't realize is that they are literally doing thousands of changes every single year. So to put it in perspective, in 2015, they did 1,000 documented changes that we could determine. In 2016, it was 1,600 changes. And in 2017, there's 2,453 changes that have been documented from Google. So that's a lot of changes, and it's really hard to know, if you were affected by any of those changes. And so how do you know? Well, how does anyone know? And it's really the online chatter. So it's understanding that you've got to look at forums and Slack channels and Twitter and Reddit to find out what the changes were, and then basically what you're looking for is who's complaining about recent drop in rankings. And once they've ruled out everything, it's sort of Google. It's like, well, I didn't do anything to my site, I haven't made any changes to it, and all of a sudden the rankings drop. That's a good indicator that Google did something. So that's kind of number one. I don't have the same, like normally I do like a list of things. I don't have that today. So today is just really more or less talking you through sort of the process of understanding, did Google hit you or is it something else? And so if you've made no changes to your site recently and your traffic changed, Google's probably made a change, and that's probably what's affecting you. So let's go through the most recent changes. So literally at the 26th of September, they made a change to image ranking. And so let's say you were trying to rank images for whatever reason. They changed it. They changed the page authority to match. Basically, page authority makes a bigger difference, and then also the position of the image on the page makes a big difference. So if it's at the top, it's a little bit more important, and if it's at the bottom, then it's a little less important. And you can see that also with links. So the very first link in your content is actually more important than your last link. So that doesn't surprise me. There was another documented change on the 19th, but we're not really sure what it was. We can't discern what it was. And also on the 12th, there was, and this is all September 2018, of just September, there's been 3 changes that we can't really put our finger on. But if you go back to August 18th, or around there, there was the medical update, and they called it the Money or Your Life update. And what that was is these companies are out there trying to sort of prey on people's needs. They have medical conditions, and a lot of these companies are preying on that. And so Google sort of whacked a lot of them if they have different kinds of content. And we've actually seen this across the board with our clients as well, is that if there was a blog post, for instance, that had medical information on it, then it actually dropped in rank unless it was authoritative from, like, it had a great source. And that would be the key there, is that if you've got medical information, if you're if some reason you've got a medical site and you have a medical service, then make sure that you're sending all the great authority signals that you need to send. Make sure that you're on Google My Business. Make sure you've got schema markup and those sort of things. It's a great way to protect yourself on that. But if you say we're a financial planner and you decided to write about maybe a client who had a brain tumor, and you got into how the attorneys were involved and all this other stuff, that content might actually get hit. Now, I don't have any great examples for you on that, but that's just kind of a random sort of example of what happened. The other thing that happened was some small changes to local rankings. And so we're not sure what the mechanism is that changed in there, but for whatever reason, local rankings have shifted. So that's your Google My Business. And we've got 2 or 3 great episodes on local SEO. So that's Google My Business. Go to google.com/business if you don't have that already. But if you were, what we've noticed is that, let's say you were trying your office, let's just say your office is in Atlanta, but you really want to get business in a suburb of Atlanta. And previously, what was happening was you could not get that business because you're outside your radius. And now, if some of the factors from what we can tell is, like, let's say your majority of your customers live in a suburb, then you'll start to rank for that. So I think it's a good change. I just wish they would tell us, how do they determine that the business is coming from there, other than the source of the reviewers, maybe the source of the traffic of people who are searching for that. So a good example might be, so if you're in a suburb and you're searching for the service, and you scroll through a lot of different ones and start to look for a very specific business, maybe that influences it. I'm not really sure. All I know is that the change was made, and that was the reference point, was that businesses that do business in a suburb but don't actually have an office in the suburb are starting to rank in those suburbs, even though their office isn't there. And as redundant as that sounds, it's actually really good news for service professionals that work, like insurance agents and real estate agents that work out of the same office but are doing business elsewhere. This is actually a really good update for them. Now, it could be a bad update if you were getting a lot of traffic because of your physical location that's on Google My Business, and your business is sort of scattered. So that could be bad news. So the other thing that's gone up is the click to call option. That is becoming more and more prevalent, which is why it's so important to have your Google My Business account fully, put as much information as you can in there. I would be posting every week. I'd be really sort of monitoring my Google My Business at least once a month, if not once a week, because it is a big deal, because Google's trying to take over. I love, there's a quote, if I can remember it, and it was basically, Google wants to be the transaction layer of the web. So anyone that wants to hire someone, do something, Google wants to own that piece. It wants to be the ultimate middleman, and so you've got to use some of those tools if you want to ride the train. And so, there's no sense in getting on soapboxes and saying, hey, let's not use Google, let's not feed the monster. The monster's already here, and so if you want to benefit from what it's doing, then go ahead and use the tools. If you don't want to benefit from what it's doing, then you can sort of ignore it and just ignore the whole online marketing space. You probably shouldn't be listening to this podcast, I guess. So that, and also the other news is that Google actually came out officially and said you can actually use reviews on your site. Now, reviews are... what you don't want to do is, you're probably already doing this, you probably already put like testimonials up, but you can actually copy the reviews off of the Google site and paste them onto yours. And so this is really cool for content. If you would like to have a testimonials page or a reviews page, and I highly, highly recommend it, is that you can copy and paste this stuff on there. And what I would recommend is that in addition to saying, this person said I was great, 5 stars, Johnny from, what I would do is actually do, when it's Johnny, I'd put from, and then I would link to a landing page that talks about your service. So let's say you were an attorney in Atlanta and you offered, I know, let's say you're a divorce attorney, and you had 5 locations. Then I would link to the location pages on your website if you had the review. So let's say Johnny says, Johnny from Roswell, and Roswell was one of your locations. I would link to that. Anyway, it's just really good content. A lot of times people in the review write something about you that you can actually link to other content from, and so having that review page gives you sort of an easier page of content to have on your site. So that's been the updates. But how do you know, though, if you've been swatted by Google? Well, I looked around for tools out there, and there's not a ton that don't spam you. One of the best ones, so there's the manual way without having to interact with companies, and then there's some other ways to look at it. So let's talk about the manual way real quick, and that is you can actually Google list of Google changes and get the actual dates, and then just log into your Google Analytics account and see if traffic has been affected. And what you need to usually do is kind of zoom out, and then you want to look for the very specific day. So one account I looked at recently, I could look at the 18th of August and tell that the line was, let's say they were getting 400 visits a day, and after the 18th, that went down to 300 average visits a day. So you can do that pretty easily in Google Analytics and just kind of compare. It's harder sometimes to do that if you've had some wild jumps and you've made some changes to your site. Another way to do that is I found a tool on SEMrush that kind of shows you when a suspected Google change was in relation to the content. And so it's kind of a neat way to look at that, your visibility as it relates to when Google's made their changes. What we found when we looked at it, though, was that a lot of times the changes, because we've been using best practices, might have affected some pages, to be honest, but they affected the pages that were maybe the least effective for the client. They affected the thin pages, the backlinko calls, those pages, the thin pages, zombie pages that don't really have any use, but these content management systems, the WordPresses of the world, sort of create pages that aren't really useful. So like, let's say an author page that has all the pages from an author, but you're a one author blog. You don't need that page. Is anyone using tags anymore? So you don't need the tags page. And even though you do need a privacy policy page, you probably don't need it indexed, so you can actually do a no index on that. So that's kind of an advanced technique. But really the simple version of how do you know if you've been swatted, it's literally just taking that overlay of the calendar of the updates and overlaying it over your search to see if it's been hit. So let's assume that you are wanting to avoid this, and that is really just following best practices. And so this ties back to the question I had said before, is that basically I had some people call in and they were wondering, one, how do I know that I've been hit by Google? But then also they had some questions about hiring a digital marketer, someone like myself, and what kind of advice do you have to a small business owner that maybe doesn't have the funds, but wants to create content that is sort of Google proof, if you will. And if you go way back in the beginning, I did an episode called Future Proof Marketing, where I actually give a strategy and some tactics on how to actually do this. And basically, the short version, it was go live on Facebook, record a video, and then take that video off of Facebook. Like, don't remove it, but download it, upload it to YouTube, take the embed code from YouTube, and then post it on to a blog post. And really, that's the tactics, but the strategy really was creating content that your target audience wants. That's the big takeaway from almost every single episode, really, is creating content that your audience actually wants, like your target audience, your target customers. And doing that is probably the biggest thing. So you could, the advice I was giving them was answer questions that you're always being asked. Is a big one if you're at a loss. Talk about a micro market. So if your competition is big multi-billion-dollar companies, you're probably not going to be able to compete with them for really big keywords, but you can go after a micro market. A great example of this is real estate agents, where going after a city real estate, city homes for sale as keyword topics is probably not going to work very well unless you are, one of the biggest real estate companies in that state, and have the budget to go after it. So what's going to work? Well, what works is going after the micro market and sort of talking about the micro niche, if you will, and targeting neighborhoods. So being your neighborhood expert. And what's interesting is that although you will get a lot less traffic, if 1,000 people a month search for Atlanta real estate, maybe only 10 a month search for your neighborhood. I'm not even talking about a suburb. I'm talking about a specific neighborhood, a subdivision, of 400 homes. And if you're targeting that, but the traffic that you're going to get is going to be so much better. It's going to be maybe 10 a month, but they're going to be highly qualified people who are interested in your content. And that's really what you want. Having a lot of traffic isn't the end all be all. Shouldn't be the goal. The goal should be conversions from a web viewer to a customer, right? And then beyond that. So really, so how do you keep your site from being whacked by Google? It's actually creating really unique, really deep content, and that's been true for over 20 years. So the best content on the planet is still king. That's the best. Now, certainly you could write a lot of great content and it not be found if you're not using sort of marketing techniques. But the very, very least, if you've listened to this podcast and you just sort of do what we talked about doing and do sort of the minimum, but then you really execute on the content and you're sharing it socially, I think you'll actually see some success without having to spend a fortune. And these budgets for beating these huge companies for those top results, I mean, the budget needs to be could be in the tens or even hundreds of thousands, depending on what you're going after. So, if you're trying, like a real estate agent trying to compete with Zillow or Redfin, you would need at least a 5-figure budget as a minimum to compete with that. So that's the way to do it, though, is create real good content. Now, sometimes people can create content that is maybe excellent, but it doesn't serve a purpose. And so that's the other thing you got to think about is the content needs to serve a purpose of moving someone closer to working with you, or it needs to be something that people are searching for. So you can go, we talked about how to do keyword research in a previous episode, but doing some basic, do a Google search on what you think about writing or what you're thinking about creating a video for. Do a Google search and see what's out there and look at the suggested alternative topics, and see if, what does Google autocomplete for you? What does Google suggest for you? Maybe those are the topics that you want to talk about. So that's pretty much it. I know it's kind of a simple answer to a really complex question of how do we know that, do we know if Google whacked us or not? And it's really just looking at the dates, and you can Google those dates. Google won't give them to you, but sites like Search Engine Journal and others have a list of these dates. And then you just look at the dates and overlay that with your analytics, whether that's Google Analytics or using a tool like SEMrush. And there's others out there. Some of them spam you pretty hard, so just be careful out there. Everybody wants your data, so just be careful out there. But that's it. I mean, that's really the short version. And then how do you avoid being whacked? And that is creating original content that's deep, that speaks to your customer, your target customer. And if you do that, even if you don't get a lot of visits, I think you'll win in the long run. And that's pretty much it for today. So thanks so much for listening. I would love it if you love this podcast or like it a little bit. I would love to get a rating on iTunes. I would love it if you shared it with your friends. I think we're close to 40 countries right now. across the world, and I think that's amazing. I would love to get to 50. Ultimately, love to get into every country. That would be awesome. And like I said in the last episode, if you are listening and you're in another country, like I saw some in Japan, I saw some in the Philippines, some in India. If you're there, and assuming you speak English, then email me at joshua@forwardmarketing.com. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to get your feedback and any show requests, any thoughts. I would love to get those and talk about them on the show. So anyway, thanks so much for listening, and make it a great day.